able to hear me now? I'm assuming that wait a thumbs up from my colleagues in the room to just check. Yeah. So if you can't hear, I'm afraid it's an issue your end. So you probably just need to check your speakers and things on your end and just check your settings to make sure you can hear. And Steve might put a few tips in the chat on that. It will be under, if you go up the top, go under more and go under settings. You should have device settings and just make sure the right speaker is set up there, and you should be okay. Okay, lovely. Right. So hopefully you're in the right place. This is some intermediate level training from Natural England on the Biodiversity Metric 4.0. And Steve, if it's okay, would you be able to just start recording, please?
It is recording.
Lovely. Oh, that's good. Excellent. I know what's going on. I'll edit that bit out seamlessly. Lovely. Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm just going to do a little. So my name's Becky Mobley. I lead the PAS project on biodiversity net gain for local authorities. And just to say, we've got a lot of people in the room, so you are on mute and cameras are off. So I'm afraid just because of the huge numbers, we can't have everybody sort of seeing everyone, which we would normally love to do. We're using Slido to manage questions rather than the chat. You can share experience in the chat and share thoughts. That's great. But in terms of questions, please do put them in Slido. You can go to slido.com and enter that code. Or if you have a phone with you, it's sometimes quite good to have it separately on your phone. So all you do, hold your phone camera up to that code and it will should open a website which you can then go into the Slido. If you like or thumbs up questions that you wanted to ask rather than repeating the same question, that really helps us managing them. We won't have much time for questions today just because there's so much content, but we will add answers alongside the other metric event answers where they're relevant. And we'll also use those to inform, your questions to inform future training needs, and Natural England will be looking at those in terms of what the needs are as well. So they'll be really useful. We'll be using some polls at the end, so it'd be great if you could answer those. It's being recorded and the slides and the recording will be up on our website next week. Okay, if you have any issues, can you just post those in the chat in terms of technical or email Steve? That would be great. And Steve's my colleague at PAS, who's also on the call. And so now I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Michael Brightman from Natural England, who is going to do the training for us.
Thanks, Becky. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. My name is Michael Brightman, and my role within Natural England is to design, create and deliver training on biodiversity net gain and by association, the metric. I sit within the policy team within Natural England's strategy and government advice team. And also on the call from that team is Maria Hardy, who's a senior advisor. And then from our metric team, we have Sam Wilson, senior specialist, whose main role is creation and delivery of training, and who has created much of what you will see delivered today. And then also another senior specialist from the metric team, Claire Cashon. Sam and I will be presenting the slides and metrics to you. And while that's going on, Maria and Claire will answer questions on Slido. As Becky said, we may not have long at the end for questions. Apologies for that, because there's quite a lot of content that we're going to deliver. So without further ado, let me share my screen. And Sam, if you can just do thumbs up to confirm that's come through. Thanks very much. So this is intermediate level training on metric 4.0, but at times where it's necessary, we will go back. We will start at the very basics to take account of those LPA staff who don't regularly use Excel and aren't experienced users. Oops, lost my mouse. So in terms of today's learning outcomes, by the end of this afternoon, you'll understand the metric in the context of biodiversity net gain policy and other related legislation. You'll know the rules and principles that underpin the metric and their ecological context, and you'll also know how to navigate a completed metric and to check that it's complete and valid. You'll also understand the scores and multipliers that are contained within the metric and how, therefore, biodiversity units are calculated. And you'll also understand the outputs of the metric. As part of the presentation, we'll also share a Natural England metric checklist and our draft must, should, could list for LPA reviewers of the metric. But just to reiterate that both of those are in the draft versions. So just as a bit of background and context, Environment Act 2021, Chair of Natural England, Tony Juniper, referred to it as a turning point for nature. What it actually does is amends the Town and Country Planning Act, TCPA, and the 2008 Planning Act, and therefore it also incorporates NSIPs, Nationally Significant Infrastructure Projects. And what it does is it mandates biodiversity net gain in the planning process, meaning that it will be a requirement for all appropriate developments, once it's mandatory, to deliver a minimum 10% net gain in biodiversity. And the calculation of that net gain will be by way of a mandatory biodiversity metric and approval of a biodiversity gain plan, with habitat being secured for at least 30 years where off-site units are delivered. In addition, there's also a statutory duty to manage and maintain the National Register of Net Gain Delivery Sites, which we refer to as the Register, and the creation of a statutory biodiversity credit scheme. Now, some of you may be asking, well, why is it that we need this policy on biodiversity net gain? And the simple answer is in order to put nature on the road to recovery. For many years, biodiversity has been routinely lost through development, and biodiversity net gain provides the opportunity to reverse this. As well as putting nature on the road to recovery, it will be important for the economy and for people. Biodiversity net gain is not seeking to prevent development, but to move development to where it has less harmful impact on nature and to provide that gain for nature. So as well as being important in terms of economic growth, because of allowing development, it's also useful for nature and also communities and people. What we're likely to see is more green areas on and around developments, and biodiversity net gain provides the most significant opportunity in decades to not only reverse the harm to nature, but to grow nature. In terms of the key points and timeline, first of all, important to acknowledge that biodiversity net gain will currently apply to England only. Mandatory biodiversity net gain is expected to commence for all large-scale and major developments in November 2023. For those developments undertaken on small sites, they will not need to comply with B&G requirements until April 2024. This extension will give both LPAs and smaller developers a longer window that will enable them to prepare for biodiversity net gain on small sites, having learned from early experiences of B&G on major sites. It's important to also acknowledge and understand that B&G doesn't replace or diminish any current protection for biodiversity or for processes that are required. So if a protection is in place currently, it will remain in place. If a process is required currently, that process will still be required after day one of mandatory biodiversity net gain. In terms of training for now and going forwards, we will deliver biodiversity net gain policy updates and the timeline through Planning Advisory Service PAS, as well as member institutes such as Landscape Institute, RTPI, and RIBA, the Royal Institute for British Architects. And we'll also look to use our own channels and webinars alongside DEFRA. Basic and intermediate training on the metric and the metric checklist will be delivered in these ways also, whereas currently for advanced level training on the metric, for ecologists and assessors of the metric, likely to be day-long courses. We're signposting people to SciEM and also to the likes of field studies councils are making training available. But Natural England are feeding into the creation and delivery of that training and providing support, for example, through training materials. In terms of biodiversity net gain, there are three key stakeholders, all as important, but all very different conversations. There is guidance available online for each of the stakeholders, and that guidance takes a number of forms and is being added to and developed over time. When you get the slides, these URLs, these links take you to those pages. A number of them are on gov.uk, biodiversity net gain, selling biodiversity units as a land manager, etc. The biodiversity metric site is the Natural England Access to Evidence, and the biodiversity net gain for local authorities is the PAS website. So what is biodiversity net gain and what is the metric? So as we've said, when it comes into force, biodiversity net gain will be mandated in the planning process. It will be a requirement for all appropriate developments to deliver 10% minimum net gain in biodiversity. And they'll do that calculation by using the statutory biodiversity metric. So the process is this: they'll calculate the baseline biodiversity unit value of a piece of land prior to a planning application. They'll then do a second calculation of the post-intervention biodiversity unit value, and the difference between the two calculations will give them their biodiversity gain or loss. As part of that calculation, they will show the units that are available on site or delivered on site, where on site means within the red line boundary of the planning application. Where less than the required number of units are delivered on site, there's a requirement to deliver the remainder of the units off site. And by off site, we mean anywhere outside the red line boundary of the planning application, but within England. For those developers that require off-site units, but where there are insufficient number of units available in the market, which there may be at day one before the market has developed, then as a last resort, developers could pursue statutory credits to offset their requirement for those remaining units. So let's talk now more about the metric and how we calculate the value of habitats using an Excel workbook. So the metric is fundamental to biodiversity net gain because it provides the measure. It has been consulted on by the Secretary of State and will be maintained and updated into the future on the 3 to 5 year review cycle. The current metric, Metric 4.0, has been a decade in development. Started with a DEFRA metric pilot in 2012, Metric 2.0 in 2019, 3.0 in 2021, and 3.1 in 2022. Metric 4.0 was published in March of this year and will form the basis of what will become the statutory metric on day one of biodiversity net gain. Once the statutory metric has been published, it won't follow these iterations that we've seen in the last couple of years, but as I said, we'll revert to the 3 to 5 year review cycle. From day one of mandatory biodiversity net gain, and by day one that means any planning application submitted on that day or afterwards will have to submit a metric, will have to submit the statutory metric. There will be no transition arrangements with regards to the metric, so the current and earlier versions cannot be submitted as part of that planning application. So the metric calculates biodiversity units by using habitats as a proxy. There are 3 habitat types: area units, hedgerow units, and watercourse units. And biodiversity net gain applies to each habitat type that is present at baseline. Where there are 0 units of hedgerow and 0 units of watercourse at baseline, then no no action is required in that regard, because a 10% gain on zero is zero. So if not present at that baseline, no action is required. However, where habitat type is present at baseline, biodiversity net gain applies to each one. So as an example, where there's a site with 100 area units, 20 hedgerow units and 40 watercourse units, that development will need to provide as a minimum post-intervention units of 110 area units, 22 hedgerow units and 44 watercourse units. A developer couldn't say that, look, I'm going to deliver instead 200 area units, which is more than the overall compensation. They cannot be summed and have to be delivered separately. So these are the mechanisms for delivery of biodiversity net gain. Firstly, on site within the red line boundary of the planning application. And a good number of developers may well deliver all of their units on site. Where they can't deliver all the required units on site, they will need to deliver the remainder of the units off site. So we will see a combination of either full on site or with some on site and some off site. The Environment Act also created the Statutory Biodiversity Credit Scheme, which will ensure that there is no delay to the planning system from day one. Where sufficient units are not available in the market of the appropriate type, then a developer can ask permission from the local planning authority to purchase statutory credits, which will offset the requirements for those units that they cannot find in the market. The metric has been developed by Natural England, but with a huge amount of input from both the Environment Agency and the Forestry Commission, as well as other external stakeholders. For example, Environment Agency have developed the watercourse elements, or the watercourse module of the metric, and the Forestry Commission hedgerow and trees. It's a tool for auditing and accounting for biodiversity losses and gains, where it uses habitat as a proxy measure, which it then translates into biodiversity units. All intertidal and terrestrial habitats, plus linear habitats, that's hedgerows, rivers and streams as example, are included. And as we've said, a developer establishes a baseline, or a landowner establishes a baseline biodiversity unit of a piece of land and then forecasts a proposed outcome. Best practice advice is that the metric should be used at site selection stage and then iteratively throughout the design process. If at site selection stage, the biodiversity unit value of a piece of land means that a developer chooses not to develop such land, then the metric has done its job, because that developer will then look for another site on which to develop. So it won't prevent the developer developing. It will just encourage them to use a site that has less biodiversity unit value. So as part of that site selection, the landowner will have done a baseline calculation of the biodiversity unit value of the land. The best practice advice is to then do a second calculation for each of the different design options for the site, using the same metric, and to use those outputs as part of a conversation that influences design and achieving best ecological outcomes. Natural England is developing a metric checklist, and this is our latest draft of that checklist, which could be used at the validation stage by local planning authorities. And I'll take you through our checklist now. So the first part of the checklist would be, is a metric required? So for all major developments from day one in November 2023, it will be required. Then there would be a check to see whether the development is exempt from B and G. It's not required to be submitted if it's self-build, has a de minimis threshold in terms of habitat, or is a biodiversity gain site. A biodiversity gain site is where it's an application that is solely for the provision of units into the market. So for example, if the planning application was to dig ponds as part of habitat creation and to sell those units into the market, that's a biodiversity gain site and is exempt from B and G. The next check would be that the correct biodiversity metric has been submitted. So it must be the statutory metric, and it must be submitted in Excel formats, not in any other formats, and no other version. The next check would be to see that there are sufficient details on the start page. There are a number of details that can be put on the start page, but the two details that must be included are the date of assessment and the assessor, where the assessor is the person who has completed the metric. The next check is whether there are any red boxes in the metric. And for most metrics, where there's a red box present, it will not pass validation. There was a lot of work done before the release of the current version metric 4.0 on red boxes within the metric, where they signal that action is required by the assessor in order to make changes so the metric is valid. So where you see a red box in the metric, it means that that something is not quite right yet, and further action is required. So in most intents and purposes, we would not expect to see red boxes in the metric, unless it's one of the following three reasons. If the application is an outline planning application, it is likely that the metric will include red boxes, because the post-intervention calculation isn't present. Secondly, so that can pass validation, but we'll comment more on what to do with that outline application later in the presentation. The second reason why it may include red boxes is that the applicant is requesting permission to purchase statutory biodiversity credits because they've not been able to find enough within the market, and therefore to be able to place within their metric. And the third reason is when Rule 5 of the metric had been instigated, and we'll tell you exactly what Rule 5 is shortly. So let's take a look at the metric in more detail. It sits within a decision framework which is based on a mitigation hierarchy and provides confidence and consistency of approach. It aids communication to a non-technical audience, but in itself is not a decision tool, but aids decision making. And it should be completed by a competent person, normally an ecologist. And in addition, when there's watercourse present within the baseline, the river condition assessor must have completed river condition assessment training. So calculation, land is measured in hectares and linear units in kilometres. For the baseline calculation, there are four key factors: the size of the habitat parcel, the condition of that habitat's distinctiveness, and whether or not there's any strategic significance in terms of the habitat itself or its location. For the post-intervention calculation, there are three additional risk factors: the difficulty to create or enhance a particular type of habitat or each type of habitat, a temporal risk or time to target condition of each habitat type, and a spatial risk, which applies only to off-site interventions around how far from the development site are the off-site units going to be provided. The difference between these two calculations gives the net change in biodiversity units, and therefore the overall biodiversity net gain or net loss. So for those of you for whom this is new, just a short explanation on a hectare, which is a metric land measurement, standard unit for measuring land, and it's equal to 10,000 square meters. So a hectare, if it was a true square, would be 100 meters by 100 meters. You may want to visualize it by thinking about the inside area of a 400-meter athletics track. So if you see a 400 meters athletics track on television or in real life, then that inside area of a 400-meter athletics track is always 1.12 hectares, so a little over a hectare. For those of you using imperial measurements, then 1 hectare is a little under 2.5 acres. So let's remind ourselves of our baseline biodiversity units. So we have, first of all, the habitat area, where that information will be inputted into the metric by the assessor. We then have the condition of the habitat parcel, again entered into the metric following a condition assessment carried out by the assessor. And then also whether or not there's any strategic significance based on habitat type or location, again entered into the metric by the assessor, where distinctiveness of the habitat is pre-populated based upon expert advice from habitat specialists. For the post-intervention biodiversity unit, as well as the four baseline factors, the assessor would then enter in the spatial risk, that is, how local to the original site are the off-site units being provided. And there would be two pre-populated multipliers, one being difficulty to create or enhance each type of habitat, and the other being the temporal risk, the time to target condition, again pre-populated and based on expert analysis by habitat specialists. So this then is how the metric does its baseline calculation with a score for each of those elements. So it takes the size of the habitat parcel in hectares, multiplies that by a score for distinctiveness, multiplies that by a score for condition, and then by a score for strategic significance. In the post-intervention calculation, we have the original factors, which we then multiply by a difficulty to create, the time to target condition, and a spatial risk. Where we see a multiplier that is more than one, then that has the effect of adding units as part of the multiplication process. So it increases the units, sorry. Where you have a multiplier that's less than one, that decreases the amount of units, and therefore the difficulty and the time to target condition reduce the amount of units for those habitat types based on the overall risk. We then get the calculation of post-intervention minus the baseline, gives us our net change in units. The metric itself is in the public domain and it's on the Natural England Access to Evidence webpage. The URL at the bottom left of this website will take you to it, or if you were to Google B&G metric 4.0, it's likely to be in the top couple of results. That URL will remain the same for when the statutory metric is available. So it will be the same link to the Natural England Access to Evidence webpage, but instead of downloading metric 4.0 from there, you would download the statutory metric. Once you download it, it's important to click to enable editing and to enable content. And it's also important that you always open it on to your laptop or PC and don't open it in a browser. If you open a metric in a browser, then it won't have full functionality. On that same web page are a number of associated guidance and documents, and the equivalent for the statutory metric will be made available at the time as well. There's a user guide that must be used in conjunction with the metric. There's a technical supplement which includes the condition assessment sheets that are necessary and are particular to the metric, alongside frequently asked questions, summary of changes, and a number of case studies. These case studies will be added to over time until there's quite a long list of what will be available there. Once we have the statutory version of the metric, a couple of days after that, we'll arrange a short 30 to 60 minute webinar to demonstrate to LPAs and to others the changes between the current metric 4.0 and the statutory metric. However, it's important to recognise that for in most circumstances, there will be no change to a calculation carried out in 4.0 and the statutory metric. So most applicants can simply copy and paste the information over from the metric 4.0 into the statutory metric, and the calculations will be exactly the same. There will be some aesthetic changes to the metric. and some additions that make it more user-friendly, as well as some changes to the user guidance. So if you're to download it from the Access to England website, this is what it would look like. However, that won't be what it looks like when you receive metrics submitted through the planning portal. One of the quirks of Excel, so not of the metric, but any Excel workbook where there are multiple tabs, is that when it's opened, it opens at the page at which on which it was last saved. Now, Sam and I will demonstrate this and how to navigate around a metric, but just to be aware, every metric is likely to open on different pages. And the first piece of advice would be, once it's open, to then navigate to the start menu, and we'll show you how to do that shortly. So here's the start menu here, and then we'd click through to go to the main menu. And the coloured cells you see there relate to the 3 habitat types: green for area, brown for hedgerow, and blue for watercourse. As different tabs are opened, they appear along the bottom of the workbook. When you open a metric that's been submitted through the planning portal, all the tabs that are included within that workbook will already be open across the bottom. And what the assessor will do when they're completing the metric is they will first of all click on one of these tabs here. That will take them inside the metric to allow them to enter the habitat parcels in terms of size, condition, distinctiveness, and strategic significance. Once they've entered all their habitat parcels, they'll then do a second calculation of the on-site post-development. That will include habitats that are lost, those that are retained, and those that are enhanced. Where an application provides all the units required for mandatory biodiversity net gain on site, these are the only 2 calculations required. Where units are required off-site, 2 further calculations are required, and these are done in the same metric. First of all, a baseline calculation of the land on which offline units are going to be provided. And then secondly, the post-intervention calculation of the habitat creation and enhancement that is happening on that off-site. Now, the metric, as we've said, is a tool for accounting for biodiversity gains and losses, but it's also a lot more than that. It's a tool for data visualization. And well, let me demonstrate what I mean. Now, we're not asking for answers in the chats. We're not asking you to put your hands up or to give out your answers. But what I'd like you to do is to use the thumbs up button when you do have an answer. So if you look at the top of your Teams screen, you see a little smiley face that shows react. If you click on react and then use the thumbs up button, don't use the button next to it saying raise, because that raises your hand. And what we're looking for is thumbs up. So it's under the react smiley face, click on that and then click on thumbs up. So when you know the answer to this question, please do thumbs up. So thumbs up once you know the answer to how many blue circles there are. And pretty simple, we can clearly see there's 9 circles. So we then ask the next question, how sure are you of your answer? So if you're sure of your answer and you can clearly see there are 9 circles, then thumbs up again, please. Excellent. So imagine though, if each circle represented a habitat parcel on a huge development site with perhaps 200 even more habitat parcels, and they're all different sizes based on their area. That would then get a bit more difficult. Let me show you what I mean. So same scenario, thumbs up when you know the answer. This time, how many number 5s are there? Here goes. Thumbs up when you know. My opportunity to just have a quick slurp of my water. Because this time it's taking a lot longer to find the answer to the question, how many number 5s are there? Once you do know, signal by doing thumbs up. So we've got answers coming in now. So we can calculate this, but it's taken us a lot longer. But here's the other thing as well. I want to ask that same question again, but we'll ask it the other way around in just a second. Again, about how sure are you of your answer? So this time, actually, if you've got an answer, but you're not sure actually that it's correct, thumbs up. So you've got an answer, but actually you're not fully confident because you're thinking, well, perhaps you've missed the number 5 or counted one twice. Thumbs up this time. Yeah, so this time we're not sure of our answer. So let me help you out again. So same question. How many number 5s are there? And thumbs up once you know. So how many number 5s? Thumbs up once you know. And of course, this time it's much quicker because it's been presented to us in a way that as humans, we can easily perceive and work out what's being presented to us. And again, this time, thumbs up. Last time, I promise. How sure are you now of your answer? So if you can now clearly see and there are 6 number 5s, you're sure of that answer, thumbs up. And this is exactly what the metric does. It converts each habitat parcel into biodiversity units, and then importantly, displays that information in a way that is easy for us as humans to interpret. And therefore, because of that, we can be confident in its outputs. Now, the metric is underpinned by a number of principles and rules. It's important for you to be aware that when the metric is submitted before Parliament, it becomes statutory, that the metric toolkit will be what will be submitted to Parliament. And therefore, we will have a statutory metric and also the user guide, including the principles and rules, and the technical documents will also be statutory. To go through the principles and rules, I'm going to unshare my screen, and I've said that the wrong way around. I'm going to unshare my screen, and to go through the principles and rules, I'm going to hand you over to Sam. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. I'll just share those now. They come up all right, Michael? Great. Okay, so yeah, we're going to work through the various principles and rules that are sort of built into the metric and what needs to be done to be able to say that the metric's been filled out in a valid method. We're going to start with the principles first and just work through those. So there's 8 of these. And the first one is something that we briefly mentioned earlier, that any existing protections and processes that are currently in place still apply. So the metric isn't here to override the mitigation hierarchy or any other processes that are already required within the planning process. It's just an additional tool to provide information. And sort of similarly following on from that, the idea of the metric is that it's used in conjunction with existing best practice principles. So not just looked at in isolation, and if the metric says something, then it's just taken as gospel. It's got to be worked alongside the existing principles that are already used everywhere. Principle 3 is around complexity. And basically that's just that the metric isn't a complex or comprehensive model. And it's not a substitute for expert ecological advice. That's why we need those competent people to fill it in so that they can give a bit of context behind it rather than just some numbers that they've managed to get out of a spreadsheet. Number 4 sort of builds on that, and that's about how the biodiversity units are a proxy value. They're not a direct measure of biodiversity. There's no real way to get a full concrete measure of biodiversity. So we use units as a proxy for that, and they're sort of treated relative to each other. Principle 5 just again, building on what we've already said, it's the metrics here to inform decisions, not to make them. And it's that important factor of having locally sourced knowledge, relevant guidance and experience, things like that, all feeding into any decisions that are made, rather than just the metric being the only thing that's used. Principle 6 talks about appropriate interventions, and what this means is that any habitat intervention that's proposed needs to be realistic and deliverable within a relevant project timeframe. Normally, that's that 30-year window that we're looking at for each metric to be delivered within. Principle 7 relates to local compensation and is sort of on that hierarchy of where things are delivered. So where it can't be on site, you can go off site, but where you do go off site, then ideally any created or enhanced habitats should try and be as local to that site of impact as possible, and where they can deliver those strategically important outcomes. And finally, Principle 8 is around compensation size, and all this means is that there isn't a maximum or minimum size ratio for areas lost to be replaced with an area. So, for instance, if you had an area of habitat that was fairly poor, low distinctiveness, but covered a hectare, you wouldn't necessarily need to put back a hectare of new habitat if what you were proposing to put back was a much better habitat in a better condition. So just to run through those quickly in summary, we're not overriding any existing protections or processes with the metric. Any existing best practice still applies. The metric isn't a complex ecological model, and it's also there as a proxy for biodiversity rather than a full measure. The metric's there to inform decisions rather than to make them. And any interventions that are proposed need to be appropriate and realistic. And remember, that's within the project timeframe that's proposed. Compensation should be local and strategic wherever possible. And that starts with on-site first and then off-site, only where you can't deliver on-site. And then finally, there's no minimum habitat size ratio. So those were the principles. Now we'll look at the rules. And the first rule is around competency, and that's just that the competency requirements have to be complied with. The definition for competency is supplied within the government's response to the consultation on the metric, and it will also be sort of available there once the statutory metrics made mandatory. Importantly, that second point that we've already touched on, that anyone who's completing a river condition assessment needs to be trained and accredited in river condition assessment. Rule 2 is about unique outputs, and that is that the biodiversity unit output of a metric is unique to that particular variation of the metric. So what that means is that if you use the statutory metric when that comes out, you can't compare the results of that to something that was done in metric 4 or metric 3.1. You need to make sure that you're using the correct metric for that. It's also meaning that the 3 types of biodiversity units generated by the metric, and as we said earlier, that's area, habitat, area, hedgerow and watercourse units, can't be summed, traded or converted between. So if you've got, like that example earlier, 100 area units and 40 watercourse units, you couldn't post-intervention deliver 200 area units and no watercourse units and say, oh, well, I've delivered all of these area units. You can't compare across the 3 different types. You have to treat them all independently of one another. Rule 3 is based on the trading rules, and the trading rules sort of say which habitats you can go from and to, and where that's appropriate. And these are determined by the distinctiveness bands. As Michael mentioned earlier, distinctiveness is auto-assigned when you apply a habitat type in the metric. So I'll just run you through quickly what those distinctiveness bands are. Very high is the sort of highest level, highest scoring habitats in the metric. And these are priority habitats, but they're ones that are sort of, they're not that well protected by being within designated sites or things like that. So they're the most at-risk habitats, and we give them the highest score. Moving down to high, that's when you've got priority habitats that are protected within those sites, but are still very very valuable. And then just a couple of examples of each of those. So your very high habitats, you're looking at blanket bog, lowland meadows, things like that. High distinctiveness is more reed beds and upland calcareous grasslands. Then coming down out of priority habitats, we've got the medium distinctiveness habitats. These are semi-natural, but they're not priority. So things like scrub, other sort of less valuable grassland types. Down to low, and that's where we've got limited biodiversity value, but still some. So modified grassland, cereal crops, introduced shrubs, those kinds of things. And then the very lowest score you can get is very low distinctiveness, which is pretty much reserved for sealed surface. So buildings, hard standing, things like that. The trading rules, this is them, and it sort of shows what you can do for each different distinctiveness band. So if you've got a very high distinctiveness habitat, you can't trade for that in the metric. So all you can do is sort of show bespoke compensation for losses, and that has to be agreed with an LPA. For high distinctiveness habitats, you have to deliver the exact same habitat type that you lose. So if you lost a reed bed, you have to put a reed bed back. Medium distinctiveness habitats, you need to go in the same broad habitat type. So that's if you lose a grassland, put a grassland back, or you can trade up to a higher distinctiveness habitat of any type. Low distinctiveness is basically you can trade it for anything that's low distinctiveness or higher. So pretty much any habitat you can put in for losing a low distinctiveness habitat, with the exception of a very low distinctiveness sealed surface. And then when we get down to very low, there are no trading rules. You can replace that with anything because they get zero value in the metric. Rule 4 is sort of builds on that trading rule a bit, but it also adds in irreplaceable habitats. And what it means is that irreplaceable or very high distinctiveness habitats can't fully be accounted for through the metric. They're too complex and too important. So for these habitats, anyone who proposes impacts on them must agree bespoke compensation with the LPA before they can proceed with those works. And importantly, and it's that agreement that's important, they can't just say they're doing it, it has to be agreed and justified as to why it's going ahead. Rule 5 is one that Michael touched on earlier that might lead to having a red box in your metric when it's completed, and it's about exceptional ecological circumstances. So we acknowledge that there is some circumstances where you might have something that doesn't meet the rules of the metric, but is actually a good ecological intervention to make. So Rule 5 is here for, in those circumstances, to allow people to say, the metric says I haven't met one of the rules or I haven't scored 10% on these units. However, this is the reason that I'm doing it. It's very important that for anyone to do this, which we expect will be in a very limited number of cases, it has to be completely agreed by the LPA that what they're saying is correct and will be a good ecological intervention, and also that you have the confidence that that intervention can be delivered. So an example, we've got a few examples on there of what they might be: decommissioning a reservoir and then putting back what was inside the reservoir previously. Obviously, that wouldn't be water, that would be something else. So you wouldn't necessarily meet the trading rules by doing that. If you create salt marsh, you might lose some linear watercourse units, but you're gaining that salt marsh. And if that is the ecological outcome that is most desirable for that area, then the developer could promote a Rule 5 use in that case. So we'll just run through those quickly again. Rule 1, a competent person needs to undertake the works, and that includes where they're doing a river condition assessment, that they've got that river condition assessment certification. Rule 2 is that outputs in the metric are unique and can't be compared, and that means between different metrics of sort of different versions, but also those 3 habitat unit types that are within the metric. Rule 3 is around the trading rules and that you have to follow those. So generally, it's always trading for the same or better. Rule 4 is that the losses of the highest value habitats, that's very high and irreplaceable, can't be fully accounted for in the metric. So bespoke compensation needs to be agreed. And Rule 5 is that in those exceptional ecological circumstances where there's a clear benefit and there's agreement from the LPA someone may be able to submit a metric with a red box that still makes sense. And that's the end of the look through those. So, Michael.
Thanks, Sam. If you can stop sharing your screen, please. And I'll share mine again. Sam, thumbs up when you can see that. Excellent. So what we've created is a must, should, and could list for LPAs to consider when reviewing a metric. So this is a draft version and will be updated as we move towards day one of mandatory biodiversity net gain. So first of all, you must follow Natural England's metric validation checklist. Natural England's metric validation checklist is not statutory, but everything that's on there is statutory, which is why I'm able to say that you must follow it. You must also apply the mitigation hierarchy, address mitigation or compensation requirements for protected habitats and species. And in doing so, have regard to National Planning Policy Framework and, with regards to irreplaceable habitats, to gov.uk guidance. The URL you see there won't take you to that guidance as yet because it's not yet live, but there will be gov.uk guidance available on irreplaceable habitats to be used in addition to what's in the NPPF. If Rule 5 is instigated, that's the one, remember, where there's exceptional circumstances and can be ecologically justified, the LPA needs to decide whether or not it agrees with the proposals. You can choose to disagree with the proposals and refuse allowance of Rule 5. So it needs to be ecologically justified, and you need to be satisfied with what's being proposed in terms of compensation. You need to check your specific biodiversity net gain target has been achieved if it's greater than 10%. If 10% hasn't been achieved, then the metric won't be valid, but it might be that an applicant submits a metric with a lesser percentage than the target that you require. Now, the next one is really important to understand, and it's one where LPAs and landowners might not be fully aware of as yet, and that concerns the riparian zone. Let me first of all explain what the riparian zone is for the non-ecologists. The riparian zone is the area of land at the top of the, on the bank top of a river extending 10 meters from the top. So you go up the slope of a river, where you get the change in slope, you measure 10 meters from there outwards, and that's the riparian zone. Riparian zones are very important and have an influence on the ecological condition of rivers, which is why they're very important. Where a red line boundary falls within the riparian zone, then the watercourse section of the metric has to be completed, and the watercourse parts that run along where the red line boundary is within the riparian zone has to be fully completed, and a 10% biodiversity net gain provided. In line with the Environment Act, an LPA must check that all on-site options have been considered before allowing off-site units. It might be, for example, that a developer will require some off-site units, and because of that, hasn't made a full effort to provide all on-site options. For example, the provision of sustainable urban drainage systems, SUDs, or rain gardens as examples. Permission to purchase statutory credits must only be given by an LPA as a last resort. Where an LPA believes that sufficient units of the correct biodiversity type are available in the market, then you should refuse that request to purchase credits. Where a metric is submitted, it must have been completed by someone who is competent. In addition to that, you must check that if anything's been submitted, that would make the metric invalid. And also, any works to create enhanced habitat in advance do not predate 30th of January 2020. Habitat creation and enhancement that has happened on or after, or started on or after 30th of January 2020 can be included as biodiversity units on site and off site. And finally, on our must list, you must check that the final metric is fully reflective of the final design. As you know, planning applications may go through several iterations, so it's important that the final design that's approved is fully reflective of the final metric submitted. In terms of you should establish and plan who will need basic level, intermediate level and advanced level training on the metric. Natural England will look to provide this basic level and intermediate level training on the metric through channels like this, like PAS, through member institutes and by using Natural England channels also, and we'll look to repeat this training going forwards. Currently, advanced level training on the metric is available through SIEM, and a number of member institutes have signalled their intent to offer it as well, and also the Field Studies Council. LPAs should have an awareness of the local biodiversity unit market for area habitats. Biodiversity unit market for all habitat types, as an example, LPA National Character Area for area habitats. The reason you should have an awareness of the local biodiversity unit market is twofold. First of all, the more that you know about units available in the local market, the easier it will be for you to refuse permission for credits to be purchased, and therefore off-site compensations to happen within your local LPA. In addition, the more you know about your local biodiversity unit market, the more you can direct those developers looking to purchase them to locations or habitats that are strategically significant and or contained within the local nature recovery strategy, LNRS. LPAs should complete checks around competence. And LPAs should also consider the scale and significance of the project and its potential risks, and from that decide what level of scrutiny and review that application is given. An LPA should review any high or very high distinctive habitats that are present at baseline and what the proposed intervention is. As an example, where a metric includes high distinctiveness habitat, what you will be looking for is firstly that they've retained that high distinctiveness habitat, and then secondly, where it's in either poor or moderate condition, that post-intervention they're looking to improve that condition to either moderate or good. LPA should, where there's an outline application, check what is being proposed, even if red boxes are present. Red boxes for an outline application aren't a reason, remember, for it not to be valid. But what you would be looking to check in particular are the distinctiveness types of habitats. What habitats are present and their distinctiveness. Where you have high distinctive habitats or above, so high, very high or irreplaceable, you would want to know what is proposed post-intervention for those habitats. Where there are only low or medium distinctive habitats on baseline of an outline application, that would not need as much review. The LPA should check on-site interventions are appropriate, where high or very high distinctive habitats are included or created. The LPA should review provision of on-site units and ensure when intertidal units are present that the metric has been completed with particular reference to the user guide. Now, as I said, the user guide is statutory and must be followed for completion of the metric. But to make you aware that for intertidal habitats, there are a number of nuances that mean that you need to pay particular reference to it. LPA should check that the strategic significance multiplier has been correctly applied, and that where an applicant is asking for a delay in habitat creation, that this is acceptable. In most circumstances, we would expect habitat creation and enhancement to start within 1 year of approval of the application. An LPA should check where an application is asking for permission to purchase statutory biodiversity credits and therefore has a red box present, that metric is fully scrutinised to ensure that it meets all the other rules. The LPA should check that the metric and the details contained within the biodiversity game plan match. Biodiversity game plan is statutory and is a statutory template provided by DEFRA. LPAs should seek to acquire information about land on which off-site units will be delivered, including proximity to the applicant's site. With that information, the LPA should then ensure that the spatial risk multiplier has been correctly applied for all off-site habitat parcels. And the LPA should check that appropriate management and monitoring is in place. You should ask for management and monitoring plan, including details of roles and responsibilities. Habitat management and monitoring plan is required for all off-site units plus significant on-site units and must cover the 30 years legal securement of those habitats. Natural England has produced a habitat management and monitoring template, but it isn't statutory that Natural England's template be used. However, as an LPA, you can advise that Natural England's template should be used. And our could list is as followed. That, first of all, you should look at the ecological review that you currently carry out on applications within your LPA and use that as a baseline to triage what's required post day one of mandatory biodiversity net gain. It's likely that a number of LPAs will not be able to review all metrics that are submitted, and this is where your triage system should come in. The metric helps you immensely with this, though, through habitat distinctiveness types. So in its simple form, you should look to review metrics where they have high distinctiveness, very high distinctiveness and irreplaceable habitats present. Metrics where at the baseline there are only low distinctiveness and medium distinctiveness habitats present will require less review. You could also check if the project has been developed in accordance with a recognised standard. As an example, you have the SIEM Biodiversity Net Gain Good Practice Principles, which is in the public domain and free of charge. There's also the British Standards Institute, but a payment is required for that guidance, and therefore it may be that some developers aren't fully aware of that. And there's also others such as the Wildlife Trust biodiversity benchmarks. LPAs could also start to increase their knowledge of watercourses within their LPA boundary and upstream and downstream of those rivers and streams. The starting point for that would be by reference to local nature recovery strategies, which will begin to capture the information on watercourses. In the past, as you will all know, watercourses have often been ignored as part of planning applications, but now they have to be fully considered. And where present on site or the red line boundary is within the riparian zone, the watercourse module of the metric needs to be completed and a 10% minimum biodiversity net gain provided for those watercourse units. An LPA could also check whether a river condition assessment is required. Sorry, could also check that where a river condition assessment is required, that the assessment was completed by someone with suitable accreditation. The expectation is that that information, the list of those who have acquired river condition assessment training and accreditation will be in the public domain, so that LPAs can check that prior to day one of will be in the public domain prior to day one of mandatory biodiversity net gain. LPAs could also review condition assessment sheets. These should be attached to the biodiversity gain plan, which is submitted with the metric as part of the planning application. LPAs could also consider for proposed habitat types and condition are realistic. So where there's a proposal to create habitat, for example, and the suggestion that it will be in good condition within the 30-year legal securement, depending on the habitat type, that might want to be queried. In addition to that, where habitat's been enhanced from poor condition, you may want to query, depending on a habitat type, where they're moving from poor to good rather than poor to moderate. And LPAs could review habitat management and monitoring plans and compare those to the assessor comments in the metric. And the LPAs could recommend use of Natural England's habitat monitoring and management plan templates. There is an advantage to making that recommendation, because then if all your applicants were using the same templates, that would potentially reduce the workload on your colleagues, because over time they will become very familiar with the layout of that template. So Sam and I are now going to demonstrate two metrics to you, take you through how to navigate a metric, the information it contains, look at the multipliers, look at the calculation, and look at the outputs. The two metrics that we demonstrate will be downloadable via the PAS website along with the slides after the weekend, as Becky stated. And in the metrics that we're going to demonstrate is this dummy development site here, which has 17 habitat parcels on it, some other neutral grassland, modified grassland, some mixed scrub, wet woodland around a pond, and some other broadleaf woodland. So I'm going to unshare my screen now, and I'm going to ask Sam to share his screen, and we will take you through an example metric. Thanks, Sam. So this metric that you see in front of you, we've created as part of this training. So, you know, as I'm sure you realise, a metric wouldn't normally have these yellow boxes showing you where the cursors are that help you navigate the metric. But we're going to demonstrate this metric now for those of you who are less au fait with Microsoft Excel. So first of all, on the metric, there's a number of ways to navigate around it. At the top right, you'll see there's a vertical cursor. And if you click on that vertical cursor, that allows you to go up and down the metric worksheet or any Excel worksheet. At the bottom right of the metric is a zoom in and out button, where you either use the plus or minus, or you can use the bar. The amount of zooming in and out required depends on two things. One, the size of the screen on which you're displaying the metric, and secondly, on an individual's eyesight. So for the zooming, you can use the plus or minus button. Just to the left of that, there's also a horizontal cursor, which if you click on that cursor, that allows you to navigate across both ways. of the metric. You'll see at the bottom, in the middle of the metric, there's a number of open worksheets or tabs. Clicking on any of those tabs will take you into that particular worksheet, as demonstrated by Sam there, or you can navigate between them by right-clicking on the little arrows that you see bottom left. You right-click, it brings up a list of them. If you were to click on one and then click OK, that would take you directly to that worksheet. You'll see that a number of the worksheets aren't fully visible. They sort of disappear halfway to the right across the bottom of the page. To be able to see all those that are present, then you can use the two little left and right arrows, bottom left of the metric, and that moves you along those tabs so you can see the ones that are hidden. So when you first open the metric, the suggestion is that you should first of all go to the start menu. So you'll see that a tab on the bottom. If it's not visible, it'll always be towards the left. Use the little left and right arrows and become visible, and then you click on the start page. The first thing you would do as part of validation would be to check that the correct metric has been submitted. So here you can clearly see that this is Biodiversity Metric 4.0. What you will be looking for, that says that it's the statutory biodiversity metric. Remember, from day one, only the statutory metric can be accepted. You'll see that on the start page, there are spaces for a number of details to be included, including the planning authority, project name, etc. As part of the metric checklist, the only things that we suggest you insist upon are who has completed the metric and the date of its assessment. All the other information on that metric start menu will be captured within other documents that have already to be submitted as part of a planning application process. You'll also see that on this metric, on the start page, we've got a red box. Because there's a red box, then this wouldn't be valid. Any red boxes on a metric mean it's not valid unless you've got those three exceptions: permission to purchase statutory credits, instigating Rule 5, or that it's an outline application. The reason for this red box here, we're going to demonstrate now, is that a question will be asked about whether or not irreplaceable habitats are present on site. Where they are present on site, you'll see that at the bottom of the screen, there's a blue tab, which Sam will click on now, for irreplaceable habitats. Now, on the current version of Metric 4.0, this is populated manually in the white cells. The way in which this is done will change in the statutory metric, but will remain intuitive. So the assessor has to say whether or not there are irreplaceable habitats on site. If there are some on site, then that tab opens at the bottom and you get an orange action may be required flag to say you'll need to enter that information. Where no irreplaceable habitats are on site, you would click on the button, click no, and you then get a green flag saying none are on site, and you'll see that our blue irreplaceable habitats tab has disappeared, as has our red box. So now, from the details you see on this page, the metric is valid. If we scroll down, then you're able to add maps into the metric, but it might be that metrics submitted to the planning portal do not have the maps inserted here. But as you know, those maps are already required as part of the planning application process. But you'll also see that we have a list of cell style conventions listed. Orange or amber mean that action may be required, but not necessarily so. It's there as a flag to the assessor to say, have you forgotten something? Are you aware of this? But A red box means that action is required, that the metric isn't valid unless there's those three exceptions, and can't be submitted as part of a planning application. Where once we enter the metric, we'll see a number of white cells and yellow cells. White cells are where the assessor enters information, and yellow cells are where they're then pre-populated based on the information that put into the white cells. And then we have grey cells that show our results. So once you've gone to the start menu and checked that you've got the assessor's name and date of assessment, in terms of metric validation, where you would go next is the headline results. So if we go to the headline results page and we scroll down to the bottom, we see on this example here that this metric isn't valid because there's a red box present. Now, the reason for that is because in this metric that we're demonstrating now, we've put our baseline units of the 17 habitat parcels, and we've told the metric which parcels are being retained and which are being enhanced and which are being lost. And because we've got some loss of habitats, that's why we've got a reduction in biodiversity units, because in this example, we haven't yet inputted the off-site units. So you'd get your metric, you'd check your start page, and then you'd come to the headline results page, where you've got a red box, unless it's permission to purchase credits, Rule 5 being instigated, or an outline application, this metric would fail validation. On the statutory metric, there will be two changes which help in terms of this process. First of all, there will be an area which shows what will be required in terms of purchase of credits, and also where there's red boxes present anywhere within a metric, there'll be a box on this headline results page saying there's a red box present in this metric. Where that red box is present, you don't need to go and find out where that red box is. The very fact that it's there means that the metric isn't valid. We'll show you now what this would look like if the metric was valid, because we've got a tab where we've pre-prepared that to show you what it looks like. So this isn't representative of this metric, because this metric is not valid because it's got the 17 habitat parcels, a number of being lost. So what we've done is we've taken an example as a screenshot from another one to show you what it does look like when it's valid. So you go to the headline results page, you scroll down, and you get a big green tick for trading rules being satisfied, and green ticks where other rules have been met as well. So this one would pass validation. You'll notice we've got some amber boxes. That's okay. Amber boxes, remember, mean that action might be required. So in this example here, we've only got area units, because on the baseline for this development site, you'll notice that there were no watercourses present. And also there were no hedgerow. And therefore we've got 0 hedgerow units and 0 watercourse units at baseline. So what the metric is showing you here with these amber flags is saying, are there 0 units on site, or have you not entered them yet? It's not saying that action is definitely required. We haven't got any on site, so we can ignore those amber boxes because we know that's the case. So we'll go back to our headline results page, Sam, if we may. And if we scroll up and look at the headline results, you'll start to find the information for the baseline. And you see in this example here that our baseline value of units is 221.97. But in our on-site post-intervention, because we've told the metric that we're going to lose some of these habitats, we've now got 131.37 units, and therefore an on-site net change of minus 90.61 units, which is 40%. I'll show you now what that baseline looks like. Remember, we had the map that I showed you that we've got here on this metric for you as a reminder to show you. So on a normal metric, you wouldn't have this tab and the site show up, but on this metric that we've created for training purposes, it's here just to show you what the baseline looks like. So from this, we then would either from the main menu click on habitat baseline area, or on this one, which we would do there now, A1, or we could go from the tabs along the bottom. And you'll see here that these habitat parcels have already been entered in. There's 17 of them, and the ones that I've described previously. Now, when you get this metric, you can use it yourself. You can enter some habitat parcels, you can change their condition, you can change the other multipliers to take a look at what effect those multipliers have. And what I'm going to demonstrate, or what Sam's going to demonstrate now, is how to enter information into the metric. And at the same time, we'll show you how the calculation happens. So for this demonstration, we're going to use, I can't remember what we said we're going to use. We're going to use the broad habitat type of grassland. And first of all, we're going to use the habitat type of modified grassland. And to keep the math simple, we're going to use an area of 1 hectare. Now, as we've entered information into the white cells, you'll see two things have happened. First of all, we've had some yellow pre-population of the distinctiveness type of the habitat. So modified grassland is low distinctiveness and therefore has a score of 2, a multiplier of 2 in the metric. You'll also see to the right, a red box has appeared saying check data. And the reason for that red box is just because we've not entered in the other 2 white cells that you see that we're going to do in a second. Once we've entered those 2, that red box will disappear and we'll get a value of the biodiversity units. For our modified grassland, the assessor would then carry out a condition assessment. And for this example, we're going to say that the condition is poor. And that gives us a score of 1, a multiplier of 1. And then we enter whether or not there's any strategic significance, and that is either by way of the habitat's location or the habitat type. And in this example, it's not included in a local plan or strategy, and therefore we have low strategic significance and a multiplier of 1. And you can see very simply here that now we've got a grey box and a result of 2 units. And the reason for that is because it's taken our 1 hectare, multiplied that by 2 for the distinctiveness of the habitat, multiplied 2 by 1 for poor condition, and therefore that remains 2, and multiplied by 1 for the strategic significance, so it's remained at 2. If in this example we change the condition to moderate, and moderate condition habitat has a score of 2, you'll see that we've now doubled the units. So a score of 2 for the distinctiveness multiplied by 2 for moderate condition gives us 4 units. Then, if we were to say that this it had strategic significance, so given its modified grassland, it would have to be based on location. We can say that this location is mentioned within the local nature recovery strategy, or currently any local plan or strategy. That tells us then it has high strategic significance and a multiplier of 1.15. So a multiplier of 1.15 increases the units by 15%. So we've gone from 4 units to 4.6 units. Now we'll leave that example there and enter another habitat parcel. And this time, broad habitat type still of grassland, but we're going to do traditional orchard. So grassland, traditional orchard. As soon as we enter traditional orchard, you'll see that traditional orchards are high distinctiveness habitats, so a score of 6. Remember what we said about high distinctiveness habitats, where they're present at baseline. We really want to know what's going to happen to those habitats in particular. Firstly, are they going to be retained? Where they are retained and are not in good condition at baseline, is the proposal to improve condition from poor to moderate or moderate to good. So we're going to use 1 hectare again to keep the maths simple as the area, this habitat parcel. Our red box for check data has come up again because we've still got to enter our other elements. So now we're going to say that this parcel is in good condition. That gives us a score of 3. And again, that we're going to have strategic significance. So we've got strategic significance, multiply 1.15. And now that's too small on my screen. Sam, what does that say? In terms of units?
20.70.
Yeah, so we can see now that this traditional orchard, although it's in best condition, can be good condition with strategic significance. 1 hectare delivers 20.7 units, which is much more than the first example of the modified grassland, given that although we've only said that that's in moderate condition. But if we're now to change that moderate condition of the modified grassland to good, Sam, we can see, even so, we're now up to 6.9 units. So only a little over 1/3 of the amount of units for high distinctiveness habitats. Now, when we go to the right in this metric, the next 2 columns, those white columns, is where the assessor says whether or not the habitats are being lost, retained, or enhanced. But so we've got 3 choices, but there's only 2 columns. Where a habitat isn't retained or enhanced, then you would put 0 in both columns, and that tells the metric that it's been lost because you've not retained it and you've not enhanced it, therefore it's been lost. But a little quirk of the metric that we just need to learn is that a habitat, in terms of the metric in these 2 columns, can only be either enhanced or enhanced or retained. We can't show it as both. So obviously, where we're looking to enhance a habitat, we must have retained it in the first place in order to do so. So the metric assumes that you've retained a habitat when you tell it that you're going to enhance it. You only enter in the retain column if you were going to retain a habitat but not do anything with it. That is, leave it in the same condition as it is as baseline. If we were to put, so for this example, we're 1 hectare in both columns, so for both retention and enhancement, you'll see that as soon as we do so, we get a red box. And that's because we've entered that in both boxes, and it tells us error in areas because the metric now thinks there's 2 hectares where there should only be 1. Once we delete one of those ones, our red box disappears because now the metric is expecting that amount to be correct. Now, if we scroll further right in this demonstration, we've got a few more columns that are showing white, which mean that they can have assessor input. Now, the 2 I want to point out first are the ones where it's got comments. So the first one where it says user comments, that's for the person filling out the metric, the assessor, to put in any comments against each of the habitat parcels. So comments might be about where they've claimed for strategic significance. It might be about where they've claimed a particular score for condition, and a whole host of other things. The next column, consenting body comments, is where the LPA reviewer can then place comments either generally on against a habitat parcel or referring back to the comments that's been entered that application. The far right column is where GIS is used and where it is that the assessor may want to enter the GIS reference number, but that column does not have to be completed. The last column that we haven't looked at, again, doesn't have to be completed, except in those circumstances where it applies. Now, you'll remember that where we have very high distinctiveness habitat, that the trading rule says that the metric cannot fully compensate for loss of very high distinctiveness habitat, and bespoke compensation should be agreed with the LPA. Where an application is looking to lose very high distinctiveness habitat, you would hope that that conversation has happened before submission of the application in terms of that loss of habitat and bespoke compensation agreed. And in the metric here, we click to say either yes or no. And so in this instance, we're going to say no. And you'll see that once we say no, we get a red box. What that's telling you is the metric is no longer valid. In order to lose our no box, sorry, our red box, we need to have checked on yes. And therefore, in other words, where there's going to be losses of very high replaceable, very high distinctiveness habitats, the applicant must agree the bespoke compensation before they submit the metric. And losses of very high distinctiveness habitat and irreplaceable habitat should only be allowed in exceptional circumstances and not for general development. So you may get, unfortunately, loss of very high distinctiveness and irreplaceable, for example, where there's the necessity for a flood prevention scheme. But even so, that bespoke compensation will still have to be agreed. There will be guidance on gov.uk on what bespoke compensation should look like where there is loss of very high or irreplaceable habitat. Another example where you might get a loss is where there's an application that includes management of ancient woodland, and in order to manage the ancient woodland, there's a need to run a track through, as an example. But in most circumstances, this column would be blank for the whole of the metric. So that's our baseline calculation, and from that baseline calculation, we've showed what it looks like in terms of the headline results. But there are a couple of other outputs that we can look at. And first of all, we're going to look at the trading summary. Now, each of the habitat types has got a separate trading summary, but on this baseline, there's no hedgerow or watercourse, so those will just have zeros against them, as you see here. So we're going to look at our trading summary for area habitats, and you'll see that on it, first of all, we'll come back to the red boxes at the top in a moment. First of all, it lists the very high distinctiveness habitats with none on site, with again though down to high distinctiveness, and it includes our traditional orchard that we've entered in addition, just to demonstrate. And then if we scroll down, it lists our medium distinctiveness, and then further down the low distinctiveness habitats. So when you're looking at this, reviewing this metric here, you know, it helps you by, first of all, confirming no very high distinctiveness habitats present, as an example. But at the top, we've got some red boxes. So action is required before this metric is valid. Now, one of the reasons is because we've entered those two additional habitats, the modified grassland and the high distinctiveness, but it's also because we've not yet entered what's going to happen for any on-site compensation and the off-site interventions. then what else do we want to show on this metric, Sam? Or are we going to move to the next one? Sorry, I've forgotten.
I think we can move to. I think we can move to the next one now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So remember, you'll get a copy of this metric, and you can play around with it as Sam and I have as well. And you'll also get a copy of this second metric that we're going to show you now as well. This second metric has the same baseline. If we go to A1 on-site habitat baseline, you'll see that it's the same 17 habitat parcels. But this one has the on-site interventions and the off-site interventions, and therefore when we skip to headline results, you'll see when we scroll down that we've got our green tick for trading rules satisfied and for other rules being abided by, and we've got a 15% biodiversity net gain. Now, returning to that A1 on-site baseline, if we scroll up, we see that we've got a couple of green boxes there, which tells us this metric is valid from that respect, that the trading rule is satisfied and our percentage change. Now, this is the area habitat summary, and this is checking that the areas match from the baseline to and post intervention on site. That is, in simplest terms, if you had a 10 hectare site at baseline, in the post intervention for on site, you expect to see a total of 10 hectares. So if, for example, here, if we just deleted one of our area habitats because we've not entered it yet, or we've forgotten, you'll see that immediately we get a red box. So if a post intervention doesn't match the baseline in terms of area, so 10 hectares equals 10 hectares, you will get a red box. When we put that habitat back, we go back to our green box, and the metric is valid. Now, one thing I just remember we've not shown you when we did our demo are two on-off switches where you can condense or show the number of columns and condense or show the number of rows. Now, if we scroll down on this metric, you'll see that there's all these blank rows that we don't need to fill in. But because of those, we can't see the totals at the bottom. So now what we can do is turn on this switch, condense show rows. And when we do so, you'll see that most of the rows disappear, and we can see our totals along the bottom. And it just helps you be able to look at the metric more easily. In addition, you've got the on-off switch called condense show columns. Now, once all the information's been entered into our metric, so we've filled in all the white cells, if we then condense that, because we've entered that information in, it will then hide some of those columns, meaning the metric isn't quite as wide as it was before, so it allows us to scroll across left to right more easily. Now, next, we're going to look at, on this example, on-site habitat creation. So that's A2, on-site habitat creation.
That's what we're already on, Michael.
Oh, sorry, I was looking for your mouse moving. Apologies. Now, in terms of on-site habitat creation, one thing to point out first of all, you'll see at the top, and it doesn't seem, and it seems counterintuitive, you've got developed land seal surface. But you'll also see that developed land seal surface has a distinctiveness of very low. The condition is not applicable, that is, it's not assessed. And you see, if you look to the right, you've got a biodiversity unit value of 0. Okay, so don't worry that you see developed land seal surface as a habitat type. It needs to be in there as a habitat type so that the area of the development site matches. Because if you didn't include your developed land seal surface, you wouldn't have that green box at the top. If you just demonstrate again, Sam, if you delete that developed land seal surface, the area there, it doesn't match. And we need to know, we want to know that those areas match, and that's why you have to show the developed land seal surface. So those habitat types, developed land seal surface and unvegetated non-seal surface, so for example, like you see with a hardcore car park, they're in there, but they have zero value in terms of biodiversity units. But what does have value, we see that we've created in here 2 green roofs. So these have been created on our development, and in applications going forward after day 1, it's likely you'll see more and more green roofs being submitted as part of planning applications, because it's a way of providing biodiversity units on site, and now there's an incentive to do so. You'll also see that we've created on site 2 allotments, and they're shown there also. Now we're going to look at on-site habitat enhancement. So that's A3. Now there are 2 ways to there are 2 ways in which a habitat can be enhanced. You can enhance the condition of a habitat, that is from poor to moderate or moderate to good, and you can enhance the distinctiveness of a habitat. So, for example, a low distinctiveness grassland, modified grassland, to a medium distinctiveness grassland, or the neutral grassland. And we see both those examples here in this metric. So the top example there is at baseline, it's under neutral grassland, but in poor condition, and we're enhancing that in this example here from poor to good. We've got some other broadleaf woodland that we're enhancing the condition from moderate to good, as we are with the wet woodland. But on the next one down, you'll see the proposed habitat of other neutral grassland, which previously was modified grassland. So here we're changing the distinctiveness from low to medium. And in doing so, that will give us additional biodiversity units. And then where we have the condition, what we're doing there is forecasting the condition at the end of the 30 years of the post-intervention. We also have the tab for strategic significance. And then if we scroll across further, we have a number of other multipliers, but we'll look at those on the offsite, I think, Sam. So that's what we've done on site. Now we're going to have a look at offsite. So remember, where you're delivering units offsite, 2 further calculations are required. First of all, the baseline calculation for the land on which you're going to deliver biodiversity units. So you need to find out the baseline first. So that's D1. And you'll see here just 3 habitat parcels on our baseline for offsite. So modified grassland, other neutral grassland, and artificial unsealed surface. And you'll see that artificial unvegetated unsealed surface as an area of 2.13 hectares. And if we scroll across, you'll see that there's zeros in the area retained and area enhanced. That's because we're going to lose that habitat. So that artificial unvegetated unsealed surface, we need to do something with that. When we click on offsite habitat creation, that habitat parcel size would have been pulled through to this part of the metric, and then the assessor then enters what's going to happen to this habitat that's been lost. So in the previous example, we showed it as of sealed surface. In this example, it's where we've got 0 units to start, and we're now going to create something. And you'll see that we're proposing to create other neutral grassland, and you'll notice that the area matches 2.13 hectares, and we're saying that in 30 years we will reach moderate condition, and we're saying that there's no strategic significance, a multiplier of 1. But you'll see a couple of other multipliers. you'll see that there's in the yellow cells that time to target condition for a neutral grassland is 5 years. And you'll also see a multiplier for that, which is below 1. So where you've got a multiplier below 1, it reduces the amount of units. And the reason it does that is because if this had been a habitat loss with unit value, then in those intervening years 1, 2, 3, and 4, until it reaches target condition, you're not providing the full amount of benefit to nature. But what we could do, and what landowners could be doing now, is they could be creating habitats in advance in order to sell into the market. Now, on the right, you'll see that currently this is 14.26 units that are being created. If we create in advance and use that cell there, habitat created in advance, and say we're going to create 3 years in advance, so say we create now and sell it in 2026, you'll see that our multiplier has increased. It's still below 1, but it's now 0.931, and our total amount of units has increased to 15.87. Now, where habitat is increased in advance, the number of units it's worth goes up each year until it reaches target condition. And the nearer it gets to target condition, the better the multipliers work from that regard. But you'll also see here, there's another multiplier, the spatial risk category. And this is the most brutal of the multipliers. It's there to incentivize local delivery, protect urban areas, and to incentivize delivery of off-site units local to the development site. Now, for area habitats, we've got a choice of 3. Where off-site units are delivered within the LPA boundary or within a national character area boundary, then the multiplier is 1, meaning that there is no effect on units. But where, instead of locally, the off-site units are delivered in a neighbouring LPA or a neighbouring NCA, then the multiplier is 0.75, which means that it reduces the units by 25%. Now, although Sam is clicking on that multiplier now, it doesn't show in this part of the metric because this isn't where the calculation happens. We'll show you where that happens in a second. Now, so that's the not local neighbouring LPO, neighbouring NCA, multiply 0.75. If you deliver further away again, so York to Devon as an example, then the multiplier is 0.5. So it reduces the units from 14.26 units to 7.13 units. And we'll show you where that will show now by going back to the headline results. So I just happened to catch that come up in the chat about LPAs and boundaries. So, and to use the example of central links. So central links is made up of 3 LPAs. So if those 3 LPAs that make up central links agree that local within the metric can mean within any of their 3 LPAs, then that's what can be included. In an example where an application straddles 2 LPAs, if both the LPAs are in agreement, then local can mean in any of those 2 LPAs. So on our headline results, you'll see here, middle left, you'll see that spatial risk multiplier, SRM deductions, and that is where you see that deduction in units of 7.13. Now, where you've got spatial risk multiplier applied, you need to check it's been applied to each of the habitat parcels to which it applies. Now, the reason I say that is that it might be that off-site units are provided on more than one site. Once you know that a site needs the spatial risk multiplier applied, you can check that it's been applied to each of the habitat parcels for that site. But if there's a second site present, that one might have a different spatial risk multiplier. So we've only got a few minutes left, Sam, so I'm thinking of drawing to a close unless there's something in particular I've forgotten to demonstrate.
No, I think you've covered it all there, Michael. Yeah.
So thanks, Sam. If you stop sharing your screen, and we'll hand back to Becky. So sorry to take up most of the time, Becky, in terms of delivery. But what I will say is that if people keep an eye on the Slido, during the course of tomorrow, I will, Sam, Claire, Maria and I will go through and answer as many of the Slido questions tomorrow. So if people want to return to Slido to see if an answer has been provided, then they can do so tomorrow.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Michael. Thanks very much, Sam. So there's obviously a lot of detail there, and I know we've got quite a mixed audience. I just wanted to flag something that I probably should have flagged to you guys that joined before you joined, that we do have an introductory session on our website as well about the metric, but also we've got a lot of resources there just generally about BNG. We were getting some very general questions about BNG and how it works, so you might want to start there. I just wanted to clarify also, I think there was a little bit of confusion about the validation side of things. So this wasn't all expected to be at validation stage. It was just the very first sort of slide there. So obviously we will have the recording and slides on our website so people can go back to those afterwards. It would be great to hear what you thought. Please go to Slido to just let us know. Yeah, I've got our website up there. You can look at that. If you sign up to the PAS bulletin, that will have sort of upcoming events and things on our web pages. Also, we have a BNG practitioner network for any LPA officers interested in biodiversity net gain. We've currently got around 580 officers on there. Yeah, it's really great for sharing expertise and things. I just had, I think, a couple of questions, as we have got a couple of minutes, that sort of came up top. So I think there was quite a lot of questions about the watercourse metric. I did want to flag that we did host some training from the Environment Agency on the watercourse metric back in spring, and that's on our website. But I think there were some questions around how people know that someone has done the, well, firstly, do LPA officers reviewing the metric need to undertake the training, but also how you know that somebody has actually completed that. Is there a list or anything? I don't know if you guys know, or I can go back to Environment Agency on that.
Yeah, no, I know that. So LPA ecologists or other colleagues don't need to have river condition assessment training, but they may want to consider it as part of their normal CPD. River condition assessment training is available. It's online. There's a cost to it, and once they've done the training, there's an exercise, and successfully completing the exercise means that they become accredited. There is a list of all accredited people, but it's not currently public facing. But what they're looking to do is, before day one of mandatory biodiversity net gain, that list will be public facing, so that an LPA could check that someone who's done a river condition assessment for a metric is accredited. So it's not there yet, but will be before day one. LPA ecologists could do it as part of CPD, but it isn't a requirement in order to review a metric.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Michael. And we've got some really good comments about saying how useful this is. I would just highlight that there's been some questions around resourcing, when things are going to be ready, the fact that we don't have that information. That is with government rather than Natural England. Natural England are a non-governmental arm's length body from DEFRA. So I think the key thing is, we're trying to share as much as we can at this time, which is tricky because we don't have some of the information about the detail. But yeah, please do go back to this resource. We'll get it on the our web pages next week. and I'll email round to let you know that it's up there. But also, if you're, if you found this all a bit too complicated, please do go back and look at, we've got a lot of resources out there that sort of explain the basics of this, because unfortunately, the more you get into it, the more complicated it gets, doesn't it, Michael? But there's some really simple stuff, but we've also got loads of people with lots of experience already doing this, so don't feel on your own.
And two more things on that is that DEFRA have signalled that they are working at pace on B&G with implementation planned for November, is the latest line to take from DEFRA. And secondly, this is just the start of the training. We'll look to repeat this type of training. We'll look to repeat the basic level training. We'll look to develop an intermediate plus to deliver at another time. And that will be going not just up to day one, but into next year and past day one for new starters, for those wanting to become more knowledgeable on the metric and the other policy areas. This is just the start of what will be delivered.
Yeah, thank you. And I think there was a point raised about pushing. Oh yes, we're pushing, don't worry. We are very much pushing. The LGA are campaigning on this, and then we're working with others, so we're not just sitting here waiting. I was just going to say, thank you so much to Sam and Michael. That was really, really useful. I think the key thing to know is just that it's not going to be perfect to start with, but we will learn as we go along. And let's keep sharing experience and working out how we do it. And I'll see you all in due course. Thank you very much for today. Michael, Sam, and Claire and Maria, did you want to stay on maybe just for a couple of minutes?
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming along.